I believe that one of the things that we miss in our lives often is being observant. I've said to our kids more than once, especially my daughters when they're out at night, I said, you need to be aware of what's going on around you. You need to be observant. Being observant can keep you safe at times. You know, you want to be aware of what's going on around you. But what's interesting is that two people can observe the same thing and draw differing conclusions. For instance, there are those people who have observed life. And they observe life and they draw different conclusions. One person observes life and he or she says, what would life be without God? But the other person observes life and draws the conclusion, there is no God. And so people can observe the same thing and come to different conclusions. Solomon's words in Ecclesiastes, go ahead and turn there to help you to find it. Find Psalms in your Bible. Psalms is a major book of the Old Testament. And so if you find Psalms and you turn to the left, you're going to come to Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes chapter 3. And in this chapter, among other chapters throughout this letter, Solomon's words reveal a philosophical, introspective contemplation. We can see it in his words. And it's actually almost as if he's speaking with two minds, two philosophical points of view. One views humanity through the lens of fatalism. Fatalism, people who are fatalistic have resolved that, you know, you're born, you live, you die, everything's heading toward annihilation. It's no big deal. Just eat, drink, and sleep and be merry, for tomorrow you die. It's a fatalistic attitude. But the other views humanity through the lens of God's sovereignty, and Solomon does both throughout this text. Ecclesiastes chapter 3, beginning at verse 16. Today I'm going to read from the New Living Translation. I just like the way that it puts it, makes it clear. So here it is, Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 16. Solomon writes, I noticed that under the sun there is evil in the courtroom. Yes, even the courts of law are corrupt. I said to myself, in due season God will judge everyone, both good and bad, for all their deeds. Verse 18. I also thought about the human condition, how God proves to people they are like animals. Verse 19. For people and animals share the same fate. Both breathe and both must die. So people have no real advantage over the animals. How meaningless. Both go to the same place. They came from dust and they return to dust. For who can prove that the human spirit goes up and the spirit of animals goes down into the earth? So I saw that there is nothing better for people than to be happy in their work. That is why we're here. No one will bring us back from death to enjoy life after we die. What I'd like for you to do with that text in your Bible is take verse 17 and 18 and just remove them from the text that we just read. And if you read those verses, 16, jump over 17 and 18, and then jump to 19 and read them through, what you will get is the impression that the person who is writing this is a pessimistic agnostic in the least. Everything is just amounts to nothing. It's dismal. It's depressing. But the real question is, does life have meaning without God? Now, Solomon knows the answer to this. But with one mind, Solomon has lived his life. He's indulged himself with every pleasure, or at least with many of them. And then he looks at life later in his life, and he realizes, all of these things that I thought was something were meaningless. But the question is glaring. Does life have meaning without God? Now, you could conclude that God doesn't make a difference, that life has meaning even without God. But before you draw that conclusion, sir or ma'am, I'd like to suggest to you, or I'd like to suggest that you consider four ramifications of a world without God. Four considerations of living in a world without God. Number one, No God, no meaning to words. Without God, communication of specific words, at least, will be difficult at best. Because without God, there is no framework or no starting point or beginning point for certain words. What are the acceptable definitions for morality or sexuality? What are the accepted definitions for what is good, what is just, what is right? Where do those definitions come from? Now, we have definitions for words, and there are those that believe that those words came about through evolution and natural processes, and they were just ingrained in man through the process of evolution. But there has to be a starting point. It's the thing that the evolutionist misses. He wants to just start somewhere in the middle, and somewhere along the way, justice popped into the mind of humankind. But there has to be a starting point. Someone had to determine the term's meaning. Now, by the way, men have a knack for distorting and twisting terms. For instance, you can have a document that says all men are created equal and everyone has a right to life, liberty, and justice. And you think, if you read that, hey, that means everybody. But there's somebody along the way who says, no, that only means the aristocracy. That doesn't mean those people because of the color of their skin. That doesn't mean those people because of their culture. See, man has a way of twisting the definitions. They have a way of twisting the definitions of sexuality. We thought it was just male and female. But now man has a way of redefining things. Therefore, there had to be an accepted meaning. There has to be some universal meaning to some terms. And I'm suggesting to you that without God, we don't have those meanings. Now, the person who gives the meanings to these terms have to have some characteristics. First of all, the three qualities that they have to possess is they must be objective. Objective. You know what that means? That means to be impartial. It means to be unprejudiced. The person who determined what justice is and gave it definition has to be unbiased. If you or I was giving a definition to justice, I would do it subjectively for what benefited me. But the person who gave meaning to these terms was objective. They must have, secondly, universality. They must have universal authority. Else, the term wouldn't carry through as history moved on. And the third thing is they must be eternal, because the eternal being will remind us through circumstances, through events, that this is what justice means. So without God, you don't have a definition for terms. You can't even have a conversation about morality, about justice, about love, about peace. Peace, you're thinking, even if you don't speak the same language, when a nation says that we want peace, everybody has a universal understanding of peace. There are points of reference in your life which enable you to define words. So the words are completely devoid of meaning if you don't have a point of reference outside of yourself to point to say, that's the example of love, so this is what love means. God is the one who gives us that frame of reference. He is the point of reference. You can't talk about love from a point of reference apart from God. Not really. You may not even believe in God. You may have never been raised in a godly home. But what you understand about love, whether you know it or not, came from God first. You can't talk about justice without some common ground of understanding. I like what Ravi Zacharias writes. He says, when you do away with God, you are actually denying the very values which are indispensable to human dignity and human transactions. We cannot interact with one another and communicate with one another and understand one another unless there is some universal meaning and understanding to certain words. God gave those words meaning. What would life be like in a world without terms that carry universal meaning? Two or three of us can agree on what a certain word means. But then when you go to the larger population, it doesn't hold together. Because who's going to hold that term? Victor and Charles and Terry and Bobby, who was up here praying, we decide that justice means that every Sunday you come in here and you give us a steak dinner, a little money on the side. Yeah. It will determine which one of us is saved. Obviously not him. But that's not going to hold together. Because as you look at that term, you're going to say, I don't define justice that way. There are universally accepted definitions for terms, and I am suggesting to you that those universal definitions come from God first. What would the world be like without these universal meanings? The answer, chaos. Murder, because thou shalt not kill would only mean what it means to you, and maybe to the other guy, he doesn't think that thou shalt not kill is a viable understanding. So, well, I kill who I want. There would be chaos. There would be mayhem. Number one, no God, no meaning to specific words. Number two, no God, no meaning for justice. Now, Solomon posits a question here. Look at verse 16 again in chapter 3. He posits a question concerning justice and the cycle of life. He says, I also notice that under the sun there is evil in the courtroom. Yes, even the courts of law are corrupt. Now, we know this to be true in our own time. But without God, the very idea of justice cannot even be discussed. Guy gets brought into the courtroom. Why did you steal that man's stuff, sir or ma'am? You know. And the guy says, I just felt like I needed to steal it. And the judge says, don't you know that that is unjust? And the guy will say, well, who determined what justice is? God has determined what justice is. Didn't he say somewhere, thou shalt not steal? Why'd you go after that man's stuff? Didn't God say, don't covet? He has given meanings to the words. He's given meaning to justice. Some believe that the laws of justice can come about by natural means, by naturalism, or even through evolution. I said that earlier, but the hypothesis doesn't hold together in my mind. The naturalism demands a godless society. You see, justice cannot be manufactured in a laboratory. There's a document that I ran across on the web. I'm always doing searches as I prepare for a message. And this document, I've never seen it before, but it's by a guy by the name of Lysander Spooner. And it's called The Science of Justice. He seems clearly to be a naturalist. And here's just a few of the things he writes. He says, if justice be not a natural principle, it is no principle at all. If it be not a natural principle, there is no such thing as justice. He says justice comes about by naturalism. You know, it's just in us as we evolve. He says the goal is to live honestly, since to live honestly means to hurt no one or give to everyone their due. What does it mean to live honestly? Who defined honesty? What does it mean to give everyone their due? Who determined what their due is? Without God teaching us about righteous living and kindness and being good to one another, we don't have that frame of reference. Naturalism declares that there's no need for God, but the laws of justice had to begin somewhere. I'm suggesting to you that they begin in the mind of God, else it would not hold together. Evolution demands a godless society. You cannot begin with survival of the fittest and end up with an organized society. You can't begin with evolution that says dog eat dog, only the strong survive, kill or be killed, eat or be eaten. You can't begin with that and end up with monogamy. How do you come through evolution and end up with the idea of one man for one woman? Now, there are some guys who have tried it. Solomon himself has tried it. That's why the brother's messed up now, and he's seeing the world this way, And that's not something that God condoned. But you can't begin with evolution. Think about evolution. We evolved from animals. How many mates and partners do animals have? A whole lot of them. Every season. How do you start with evolution and naturalism and end up with one man and one woman who's supposed to be together and love one another? It begins with God. Adam and Eve. That's our model. So you can't start with evolution and end up with a society that has God. It doesn't stand to reason. Society holds the values that we hold because they were established a long time ago. Justice and injustice are concepts that don't even make sense apart from God. But creationism demands a God society. It's the believer who recognizes he's been divinely created. It's the believer who recognizes that there is a divine lawgiver. Thus, the believer holds on to the meanings of these words. And I'm going to give you at least 4 reasons why. Number 1, because they have the knowledge and assurance that justice will be done. Look what Solomon writes in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 17. He says, I said to myself, in due season, God will judge everyone, both good and bad, for all deeds. That's verse 17 that we removed from the text. When you put it back in, then you see that Solomon's not fatalistic, but he's saying, there's a time coming. It's right there in the text. Secondly, believers hold to the meanings of these words because they have faith that gives peace of mind in the knowledge of God's sovereignty. Look at verse 12 and 13 in your text, Ecclesiastes chapter 3. So I concluded there is nothing better than to be happy and enjoy ourselves as long as we can. And people should eat and drink and enjoy the fruits of their labor, for they are the gift of God. Some people are depressed. Some people are down because you're focused on everything else, or maybe you think you don't deserve a particular thing. But Solomon says these are the gifts of God for our enjoyment in the here and now. And the reason you can do that is because you know in the hereafter you have eternity with the great Creator. Here's a third reason that believers hold on to these terms, because they have revelation that there is a difference between the temporal and the eternal. This is what Jesus himself says in Matthew chapter 6. He says, don't store up treasures here on earth where moths eat them and rust destroys them and where thieves break in and steal. Store your treasures in heaven where moths and rust cannot destroy and thieves do not break in and steal. Wherever your treasure is, there the desires of your heart will be also. Here's a fourth and final reason that we as believers hold on to the meanings of words as prescribed by God. Because we know that our God owns eternity. We'll be with him. He's the one who will last forever. The most leading atheist will die out one day, but God will last forever. The unbeliever and the atheist and the secularist and the humanist, they don't even speak in terms of eternity. They can't because they're fatalistic. Our existence ends at death. But look at what Solomon writes in verse 19 and 20. He says in chapter 3, for people and animals share the same fate. Both breathe and both must die, so people have no real advantage over the animals. How meaningless. Both go to the same place. They came from the dust and they return to dust. If you just take that, then you'd be like the fatalist. But look at what he says up in verse 11 in chapter 3. He says, yet God has made everything beautiful for its own time. He has planted eternity in the human heart. But even so, people cannot see the whole scope of God's work from the beginning to the end. They don't have spiritual 2020 vision, which is the title of this series. You need to see with spiritual 2020 vision. By the way, everybody, even the unbeliever, the atheist, the agnostic, everybody's going into the eternity. It's just that some of us are going in prepared and others are going into eternity ill prepared. And they won't be able to change their mind or change their destination at this time. No God, no meaning to specific terms. No God, no meaning to justice. Thirdly, no God, no meaning for love. The advancements of technology are amazing, aren't they? I mean, they have machines that can play checkers and play chess and beat you at it. You know, we like the little games. We had a pastor and his wife come over, Cynthia and I, and he had this game on the tablet where I forget the name of that game, Cynthia, but you'd hold it up and the person behind the tablet can't see it. And so it would give you like some words and you had to think of what those words describe, like flaky crushed, cherry, apple. Oh, you're talking about a pie, something like that, So, and everybody was good at it, but me. Every time they held it up, and the thing, when you miss it, you'd hold the tablet back and the thing goes dong. Now, if you got it, you hold it down, it goes ding. I didn't get many dings, and I declared that game as satanic. I don't want to play it anymore. So they have stuff like that. In Toshiba's lab, scientific lab, they created a humanoid robot. And they decided that they were going to give this robot the ability to love. And so they load up this robot with this software, and this software enabled this robot to love. And they declared it a success. His name was Kenji, and Kenji demonstrated love by bonding with a stuffed doll, which he would embrace for hours. Kenji is displaying love. I mean, there's some guys that, you retire with your lovely bride. Depends on, how many years you've been married and their age. But you retire with your lovely bride and you say, and she says, hold me. You go to bed and it's like, just hold me, honey. And you're holding them. About 3 minutes in, they say, woo, get off of me. It's hot in here, Not that I have any experience with that. What's wrong with you? I'm flashing. Flash what? I'm not talking about me. Kenji was holding that doll for some hours, man. So they declared it a success. When the doll was not around, Kenji would ask about the doll. Where's my baby? Where's my doll? I'm just telling you what the resource, what it says at the research that I did. But they had to soon declare it was not a success. Because the problem is, Kenji began to fall in love with every human being and thing they put in front of him. So they had to stop showing Kenji and people to Kenji and Kenji to people. You see, the effects of love and affection and altruism cannot be manufactured in a lab. You can't recreate it. And love can be mimicked in terms of the results of love. You can mimic it, but you can't scientifically create it. So a world based solely on science and reason will result in a loveless society. But science and reason mixed with faith will cause you to arrive at God. See, science and reason are not evil. But when you begin with a presupposition that there is no God, you end up with no God. But when you begin with a presupposition that there is God, and then you do science, you will end up with all the wonderful things that science has given us, but you recognize that there is a divine creator who has given us things that you can't recreate in the lab, and love is one of them. Without God, there may be love, but what kind of love would it be? Physical love is fleeting. The minute there's a few wrinkles and you get too old, then it's like, well, physical love is not going to sustain us. Emotional love is wishy-washy, and puppy love is immature, and material love is temporal and vain. How can we come to understand what love is? What is our example? Well, apart from God, we don't. In 1 Corinthians chapter 13, the love chapter, we read, love is patient and kind. Love is not jealous or boastful or proud or rude. It does not demand its own way. It's not irritable, and it keeps no record of being wronged. It does not rejoice about injustice, but rejoices whenever the truth wins out. Love never gives up, never loses faith, is always hopeful, and endures through every circumstance. Without God, we don't really understand what true love is. What does he say in the text? Patience. How patient is God? You want the example of patience? Look at God. He mentions jealousy, boastfulness, and pride. How humble can a person be when you look at God, who humbled himself, took on the form of a man, and came to die for sinners like me? Now that's humility. It mentions keeps no record of being wrong. We're told that God forgives our sins and he casts them as far as the east is from the west. It says, does not rejoice in injustice. Well, the Bible I read says when they strung him up, took him through a faulty trial and strung him up on the cross, he said, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. He did not rejoice. Love never gives up. How long did it take before you came to Christ? Love never gives up. The love of God never gives up, stays after you. Or have you even come to him yet? Are you out there still questioning God? And because you feel like you don't have any answers, you decided you won't believe in him or follow him. But God is patient. What would life be without love? The answer, not worth living. Fourth and final point. No God, no meaning for life. You know, you can understand why people like to do things to enhance their life. They want a cream that they can put on their face that will work, so it will resist wrinkles. They want a diet that will work and they'll lose weight. They want things like drugs that will enhance your mind. I remember several years back, somebody told me that there was something called ginkgo biloba. And you know, if you take it, your memory will get better and you'll remember stuff. You know, and I'm like, yeah, ginkgo biloba. I need to remember stuff. You know, I want some of that stuff. You know, it stinks too. It's stinky. What they didn't tell me is that you can overdose on ginkgo biloba. So 8 days later after being in the hospital, no, I just made that up. I just made that up. My point is that people want something that works, that gives meaning. By the way, have you ever considered what you would do if you could live forever? Think about it. You can live forever. You will never die. So what would you do? Go ahead, you know, if they had that little music, doon, 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 you're thinking about living forever. You're thinking about you would eat all the exotic foods that you want to eat. Not me, because you know how picky I am. You'd go to all the exotic places. Maybe you would strive for power and authority. You'd maybe have like a home here and then a home in the Hollywood Hills and maybe some extravagant apartment in New York. I mean, you're living forever. Even the mistakes that you make, you say, it's no big deal. I'm living forever. I'm not dying anytime soon. I'm not dying ever. If you lived forever, what would you do with it? You need to understand and come to the realization that having things and possessions will never satisfy. That's not the meaning to life. And if you need an example, just consider the celebrities. Talented people. They get money. They got a home in the Hollywood Hills, an apartment in New York. I saw some celebrities who have bought islands for themselves. They got it all, don't they? And yet you read in the paper about one of them dying with a needle stuck in his arm. Why? Because the things that they had, that we look at and say, I wish I had that, it never satisfied them. And when they weren't satisfied, they became depressed. And when they became depressed, they start turning to drugs. How many celebrities, come on, I'm not the only one who's seen TV with how many celebrities get involved in drugs. You see their extravagant homes. It will not satisfy. Apparently having knowledge and pleasure and health and things is not enough. Look what Solomon writes. In verse 19, he says, for people and animals share the same fate. They're going to die. How meaningless. You're born, you eat, you sleep, you strive for things to make your life good, and then you die. I love what William Lane Craig once said. He says, for if there is no God, then man's life becomes absurd. Everything physical in this world has a reason for its existence outside of itself. If it began within us, we would mess it up because that's what we do. We're flawed, but it had to come from something, three qualities that is uncaused. It means no one caused it to come into being. It came from something that is non-physical, and it came from something that is infinite. And the only thing to fit the bill is God. He is the one who caused justice and love and all of these things to come into being. I like this quote from Mark Middleburg. He writes, without God, there is no purpose for life, no better destiny, no higher ideal. We're just accidental creatures in a world where only the fittest will survive. Under that point of view, we as humans have no more intrinsic value than any other animal. It takes a wise person to come to the conclusion that their lives are nothing without God. Again, quoting Solomon, look at verse 1 of chapter 3. What does he say? He says, for everything there is a season and a time for every activity under heaven. And then he says a time to plant and a time to pull up, a time to sow and a time to reap, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to cry, and a time to laugh, a time to be born, and a time to die. And then back to our verse 11, he comes to the conclusion, yet God has made everything beautiful for its own time. He has planted eternity in the human hearts, just like he planted justice in the human hearts and love in the human hearts. That's why it seems to be apart. Men in remotest places can come to an understanding of monogamy, of theft, or things like that. I love the story that Ravi Zacharias tells, where he says that there's a man who is stranded on an island for 25 years. And then this boat finally comes and finds him on the island, and they say, hey, we came to rescue you. And the man says, yay, you came to rescue me. And they said, oh, well, what did you do on the island for 25 years? We see that there are 3 huts here that you built. Well, what's that hut? He said, oh, that's my home. That hut is my home. He said, well, what's that second hut? He said, well, that's my church. That's where I worship. He said, what's the third hut? He said, well, that's the church I used to go to. You even leave a person by themselves and they mess things up, are never satisfied. We need a God who has holiness. We need a God to demonstrate love. We need a God who's greater than us because we mess it up. Without God, you don't have anything. Your life is meaningless. You need him. You need him desperately. The fact that you don't understand a thing is no reason to not believe it. I don't understand fully how my computer works, but I bought one. You don't really understand fully how oxygen works. Oh, yeah, I do. It's H2O. Yeah, but how come it takes 2 parts hydrogen and 1 part oxygen? Well, see, the properties of hydrogen and oxygen, they attract, and when you get 2 hydrogen... Yeah, but how come it's that way? Well, see, that's the way, as it evolved. Well, how come it evolved that way? Well, why do we have to breathe air anyway? Well, see, the lungs need air and then the heart, and it goes into the brain. Well, how come the brain and the heart need air? Well, see, that's just the way well, how come we can't breathe water? Because there's more water on the face of the planet than there is land. And if we evolve naturally, then wouldn't we go to the place through evolutionary process where there's more room? Wouldn't that be water? How come we don't breathe water? Doesn't that make... Well, see, that's just not the way it... You don't fully understand it, do you? You don't know why, but it hasn't stopped you from breathing air, has it? Because you don't fully understand something doesn't mean that you don't believe in it. Let me close this. You will never understand God. You will never fully grasp him. I love Job's words. In Job chapter 4:17, he says, can a mortal be more righteous than God? Can a man be more pure than his maker? You will never understand him, but you need him. Friedrich Nietzsche wrote a book. In the German, I think it's something like Gott ist tot, which means God is dead. One of the lines in the book is, God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. Do you know how he spent the last 13 years of his life? 13 years before he died, he went insane. And so his sister cared for him. And then I think his mother cared for him, if I have the story correct. And as they sat by his bedside, there would be weeks at a time that he would be silent. He wouldn't say anything. And then he would blurt something out. Guess what he blurted out? A Bible verse that he learned as a child. You need him. You need him. Your philosophy and your theory and your evolution will not hold up. When you face eternity, when you're facing death, you need God. The only thing that's going to stand. Well, Pastor, you see my marriage, we're not getting along. You need God. Well, Pastor, my child is acting up. You need God because you need someone you can pray to who can do something about it. Well, Pastor, I'm going through this and I got this habit. You need God. God is the only thing that is sure, solid. You need him. It was the Gaithers who understood that apart from God, life has no meaning. And so they write this song, God Sent His Son, and they called Him Jesus. He came to save and heal and forgive. He lived and died to buy my pardon, and an empty grave is there to prove my Savior lives. And then what do they say? Because He lives, I can face tomorrow. You may deny God. You may be living a raggedy life. But God knows it, and you need Him. But His word said He's patient. How much longer will you wait? Go ahead and stand to your feet. How much longer will you deny Him? How much longer will you live and walk and talk in a way that is dishonoring to God? It could be that a lot of the problems you're having financially, emotionally, is because you have not committed your life to God. You need Him. I will tell you tonight about 4 other atheists whose lives took a turn after denying God all their lives. They came to the same conclusion that I'm giving you this morning. You need